I was standing ankle-deep in mud at a commercial job site when my father, Douglas, called. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't mention the $850,000 of debt I'd spent 5 years clearing to save his historic estate. He just delivered the news like a weather report. "We are gifting the deed to the nursery to Hunter as a wedding present," he said. "It looks better for the family if the man holds the property." I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, waiting for the punchline. It came a second later. "And Rowan, we need you to run the catering. We are trying to save money on staff. So please wear black. Before I tell you how I turned their wedding of the century into a public courtroom, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community." $850,000. That was the number that had defined every breath I took for the last 5 years. It wasn't just a debt. It was a gravitational force that had crushed my 20s into a flat, gray line of austerity. While my friends were buying starter homes or traveling to Italy, I was funneling 80% of my architect salary into a business that didn't even have my name on the letterhead. I remember the day I took over the debt. It was raining. The kind of relentless Oregon drizzle that seeps into your bones. The nursery was dying. Literally. Rows of hydrangeas were turning brown in the greenhouses because the irrigation system had failed, and my father, Douglas, couldn't afford the repairs. He was sitting in his office, staring at a foreclosure notice, like it was a foreign language. My mother, Catherine, was pacing, talking about appearances, about what the neighbors would whisper if the Ellis legacy collapsed. They were drowning. And I did what I was trained to do. I became the life raft. I moved into a 300-square-foot studio apartment above a noisy bakery because it was cheap. I drove a truck with a rusted wheel well that rattled when I hit 40 miles per hour. I ate rice and beans and worked 60-hour weeks, designing landscapes for tech billionaires, then spending my weekends ankle-deep in compost at the nursery, fixing what my father had broken. And where was Hunter during the Great Rescue mission? He was in Berlin, then Tokyo, then Austin. He was finding himself. He was launching tech startups that evaporated as soon as the seed money ran out. He was posting photos of artisanal coffee and rooftop bars while I was negotiating payment plans with fertilizer vendors. I never questioned it. I never asked why the son who drained the accounts was celebrated as a visionary, while the daughter who refilled them was treated like a utility bill necessary, boring, and expected to be paid on time. That is the trap of normalized cruelty. You don't wake up one day and decide to let people use you. It happens by degrees. It starts when you are 5, and you realize that your parents' smiles are brighter when your brother walks into the room. It solidifies when you are 12, and you learn that your achievements are expected, while his are miraculous. You start to believe that love is a transaction. You think that if you just pay enough, fix enough, and suffer enough, you will finally buy your way into their hearts. You convince yourself that being the reliable one is a badge of honor, not a cage. I thought I was earning my legacy. I thought I was proving that I was worthy of the Ellis name. But I missed the fine print. 6 months ago, when the debt was finally cleared and the business was turning a profit for the first time in a decade, I sat my parents down. I showed them the spreadsheets. I outlined a plan to modernize the brand, to pivot towards sustainable, high-end landscape architecture. Douglas didn't look at the charts. He looked at me with a pitying sort of smile. The kind you give a child who doesn't understand how the world works. "Rowan," he said, his voice thick with condescension, "you are a wonderful designer. But the nursery needs a man at the helm. Investors, clients, they just feel more comfortable dealing with a male CEO. It is about optics. Sweetheart, you understand. Hunter has that entrepreneurial spirit. He is the face. You are the hands." I didn't scream. I didn't flip the table. I just nodded, swallowed the bile in my throat, and went back to work. I told myself they would come around. I told myself that competence would eventually outweigh chromosomes. But standing there in the mud, listening to the dial tone after my father told me to wear black and run the catering, the illusion finally snapped. They didn't see me as a partner. They didn't even see me as a daughter. I was just the staff they hadn't bothered to pay. I didn't throw the phone. I didn't scream into the void. I just pressed end call and watched the screen go black. It is strange how the biggest moments of your life don't always come with fireworks. Sometimes, they just come with a sudden, absolute drop in temperature. The heat of my anger. The warmth of my hope. It all just evaporated. What was left was cold. Hard. And sharp. I climbed into my truck and turned the key. The engine coughed to life. A mechanical struggle that mirrored my last 5 years. I drove toward the city. Passing the turnoff for my apartment. I pictured it in my mind, that tiny, airless box with the mattress on the floor, because I couldn't justify the cost of a bed frame when the nursery needed a new irrigation pump. I thought about the dust settling on my unread books. The empty fridge. The life I had put on hold. Then I thought about the wedding invitation. The crystal glasses. The silk tablecloths. The sheer, gluttonous luxury I had subsidized with my own poverty. They thought I was silent because I was compliant. They didn't realize that silence is also the sound of a closing vault. I wasn't Rowan the daughter anymore. I wasn't the helpful sister or the catering staff. I was a creditor. And the bill was past due. I pulled up to a steel and glass tower in downtown Portland. This wasn't the world of soil and seasons. This was the world of contracts and consequences. I took the elevator to the 42nd floor. Uncle Keith was the corporate attorney who had drafted the bailout paperwork 5 years ago. He was a shark in a 3-piece suit. The only member of the extended family who preferred leverage over loyalty. I walked past the receptionist without stopping. I didn't go there to cry on his shoulder. I went there to pull the trigger. Keith's office smelled like leather and expensive ambition. He didn't offer me coffee or platitudes. He just motioned to the chair opposite his massive mahogany desk and steepled his fingers. I laid it out for him. The wedding. The gift. The catering demand. I kept my voice flat. Factual. Emotion is just bad data in a legal briefing. When I finished, Keith didn't look shocked. He looked vindicated. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick file folder. The same one we'd signed 5 years ago, when the business was hemorrhaging money. He flipped to page 47 and tapped a paragraph highlighted in yellow. It was dense legal jargon. The kind my parents had glossed over because they were too busy panicking about their credit scores. It is called a right of first refusal, Keith said. His voice smooth as polished stone. I inserted it as a safeguard. It stipulates that in the event of any transfer of deed sale, gift, or inheritance, the primary creditor has the option to seize full ownership immediately to protect their financial interest. I stared at the words. Primary creditor. That was me, not the bank. Me, he continued. The moment Douglas signs that deed over to Hunter, even as a gift, it triggers a change of control event. That clause wakes up. And because you hold the debt, you have 48 hours to execute your option. You can essentially purchase the equity using the debt you already hold. You don't have to pay them a dime. Rowan, you just have to sign a paper. It was a Trojan horse. A legal landmine buried 5 years ago, waiting for someone to step on it. My parents thought they were giving Hunter a kingdom. They didn't realize they were handing me the keys to the castle. So, Keith asked, looking at me over his glasses, do you want to stop the wedding? No, I said. I want them to sign it. I want them to stand up in front of their wealthy friends and their investors and sign that paper. I want the ink to be wet when we walk in. Keith smiled. A sharp, predatory expression. Then we wait. The next 2 weeks were a study in duality. On the surface, I was the obedient daughter. I replied to my mother's barrage of texts with simple confirmations. Yes. I ordered the vegan canapes. Yes. I would use the service entrance. Yes. I would wear black and stay out of the family photos. Inside, I was sharpening a blade. Hunter sent me a text 3 days before the wedding. It was a photo of him, standing in front of the main greenhouse. Arms spread wide like he owned the sunlight hitting the glass. The caption read, Empire State of Mind. Can't wait to take this place to the next level. Thanks for holding down the fort. Sis. Holding down the fort. As if I were a temp. As if the 80-hour weeks and the missed holidays and the empty bank account were just me keeping his seat warm. I didn't reply. I didn't delete it either. I saved it to a folder labeled Evidence. Then, 2 days before the ceremony, Keith called me back to his office. His face was grim this time. We ran a final title search. He said, just to be sure the paperwork was clean before the transfer. It isn't. He slid a document across the desk. It was a lien. A massive. The high-interest loan taken out against the property's future equity. The date was 6 months ago. The signature was my father's, shaky, but legible. But the beneficiary wasn't the business. It was a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. It's Hunter, Keith said. He forged Douglas's signature. He's been trading crypto on margin. Rowan. He lost everything. He leveraged the house thinking he already owned it. If this transfer goes through, the bank seizes the property in 30 days. The room spun. My parents weren't just gifting Hunter a business. They were handing him a grenade, with the pin already pulled. And they didn't even know it. Hunter had mortgaged their legacy to cover his gambling debts. And he was smiling for the cameras, while the fuse burned down. I sat back. The realization settling over me like a heavy coat. I could warn them. I could call Douglas right now, and tell him his golden boy was a fraud. I could stop the transfer. Save the house. And go back to being the dutiful, invisible daughter who fixes everything. But then I remembered the mud. I remembered the catering demand. I remembered 5 years of silence. Let him sign. I told Keith. Let him sign the deed. Let him think he got away with it. And then, when the ink is dry, we take it all. The wedding day arrived with a sky so blue it looked expensive. The estate was breathtaking. The Japanese maples I had nursed back to health were blazing red. And the antique rose garden, my personal project for 3 years, was in full, riotous bloom. It was the perfect backdrop for a legacy. Just not mine. I arrived at 6 in the morning through the service entrance, wearing black slacks and a black button-down shirt. Indistinguishable from the hired waitstaff. My mother, Catherine, met me in the kitchen. She didn't say hello. She just handed me a clipboard. Make sure the champagne flutes are polished, she said, her eyes scanning my outfit with a critical squint. And try to stay in the background during the ceremony. Rowan, we don't want to confuse the guests about why you aren't in the family pew. I took the clipboard. I didn't argue. I didn't remind her that the only reason she could afford champagne flutes was because I had eaten ramen for 1900 days. I just went to work. I polished the glass. I arranged the vegan canapes. I watched Hunter strut around the grounds in a tuxedo that cost more than my truck. Shaking hands with investors. Playing the part of the magnanimous heir. He looked the part. He always did. That was his talent, looking like a CEO while possessing the business acumen of a toddler. The ceremony took place at 2 o'clock in the main garden. I stood behind a trellis of jasmine, holding a tray of empty glasses, watching my family perform their play. Hunter's fiancée, a sweet girl from old money who had no idea she was marrying a walking bankruptcy filing, looked adoringly at him. Douglas gave a speech. He talked about passing the torch. He talked about how the Ellis Nursery had stood for 3 generations of integrity. Then came the moment. A notary stepped forward with the deed. A table was brought out. This was the centerpiece of the event, the ceremonial signing. Douglas uncapped a fountain pen. To my son, he announced, his voice booming over the microphone. The future of this estate. He signed. Then Hunter signed. Grinning like a shark. The guests applauded. The in-laws beamed. The ink was wet. That was the signal. I set the tray of glasses down on a stone bench. I didn't take off my apron. I wanted them to see me exactly as they had designed me. The help. I walked out from behind the trellis. Uncle Keith stepped out from the side entrance, clutching a leather briefcase. We walked straight down the center aisle, the gravel crunching loudly under our feet. The applause died out, replaced by a confused murmur. Douglas looked up, annoyance flashing in his eyes. Rowan, he hissed. What are you doing? Get back to the kitchen. I didn't stop until I was standing directly in front of the table. I looked at the deed. I looked at Hunter. Then I looked at my father. "I'm afraid you can't give this property away." "Douglas," I said. My voice wasn't loud. But in the sudden silence, it carried to the back row. Hunter laughed. A nervous, jagged sound. "Go pour some drinks." "Sis, you're embarrassing yourself." Keith stepped forward and laid a document over the deed. It wasn't a toast. It was a court order. "Actually," Keith said, his voice projecting with courtroom authority, "we are exercising the right of first refusal clause contained in the restructuring agreement of 2019. By attempting to transfer the title, you have triggered a change of control event. As the primary creditor who holds the $850,000 debt on this estate, my client is exercising her option to purchase the equity immediately." Client Catherine whispered, standing up. "What client?" Keith gestured to me. I pulled the executed purchase agreement from my apron pocket. "I've already signed it," I said. "The debt I hold cancels out the purchase price. As of this moment, I own the nursery, I own the house, and I own the land you are standing on." The silence was absolute. It was heavy, suffocating. You could hear the wind moving through the trees I had planted. "You can't do that," Douglas sputtered, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "That's my property. It hasn't been your property in 5 years." "Dad," I said. "It was the bank's property, and I bought the bank." Hunter lunged forward, grabbing the table. "This is insane. Security, get her out of here." "Sit down, Hunter," I snapped. The command was so sharp, so filled with the authority I had earned through years of cleaning up his messes, that he actually froze. "We aren't done," I continued. I turned to the in-laws, the wealthy family Hunter was trying to impress. "I'm sorry to ruin the party, but you should probably see this before you let your daughter sign a marriage license." Keith pulled the second document from his briefcase, the lien. "Your son forged his father's signature to take out a high-interest loan against this property 6 months ago," I said, looking directly at the bride's father. "He used it to cover a crypto margin call. The money is gone. This estate is leveraged to the hilt. If I hadn't just seized it, the bank would have foreclosed next week." I watched the realization hit the crowd like a shockwave. The bride burst into tears. Her father stood up, face stony, and pulled her away from Hunter. Hunter was stammering, looking at Douglas, trying to find a lie that would work. But Douglas wasn't looking at Hunter. He was looking at me. And in that moment, I saw something crumble in his eyes. It is a strange thing to watch a giant shrink. For my whole life, my parents had loomed over me, these titans of authority who decided my worth. But as I stood there, holding the deed to their kingdom, I realized they were small. They were terrified. There is a concept in psychology called the illusion of power in an empty wallet. We think status comes from who we are. But so often, it is a costume, rented with money. My parents had wrapped themselves in the identity of legacy and dynasty. They believed their authority was innate, but it wasn't. It was purchased, and I was the one who had been paying the bill. Now that the transaction was over, the costume fell apart. They weren't the lords of the manor. They were just 2 elderly people who had bet on the wrong child and lost everything. "Get off my property," I said. Douglas opened his mouth to argue, to play the "I'm your father" card. But he looked at the police officers Keith had hired to stand at the perimeter just in case, and he closed it again. The wedding didn't end. It dissolved. The guests fled to their cars, whispering. The in-laws took their daughter and left without a backward glance. Hunter was left standing at the altar alone. A king without a kingdom. A groom without a bride. I didn't stay to watch them pack. I walked into the main greenhouse, the one where I had spent thousands of hours pruning and watering. I took a deep breath. The air smelled of damp earth and growth. It didn't smell like debt anymore. It smelled like mine. The fallout wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. The way a room goes quiet after a vase shatters. The police escorted Douglas and Catherine off the property an hour later. They didn't scream. They just looked old, shrinking into the back seat of a taxi, because their luxury SUV was leased in the company name. And I had already canceled the contract. Hunter didn't leave in a taxi. He left in the back of a squad car. The in-laws had pressed charges for fraud before they even left the parking lot. It turns out, wealthy people don't like being forged into debt by their son-in-law. The entrepreneur is currently facing 3 counts of wire fraud and grand larceny. He wanted to build an empire. He ended up building a criminal record. My parents moved into a 2-bedroom rental on the other side of town. I heard through the grapevine that they spend their days telling anyone who will listen about their ungrateful daughter who stole their legacy. They still think the house was theirs to give. They still think love is something you are owed, not something you earn. I don't correct them. I blocked their numbers the day after the wedding. Silence is the only luxury I care about now. I stood in the nursery this morning. It is officially spring. The hydrangeas are blooming again. Vibrant and strong. I didn't keep the old name. The sign out front now reads, Ellis Landscape Architecture. I hired a new team. I promoted the assistant grower my father had ignored for years. And I did one more thing. I launched the Ellis Grant. It is a full scholarship and business incubator for female landscape architects who are struggling to get a foothold in this industry. Every year, I take a percentage of the profits I earned, and I use it to make sure no other woman has to hide behind a man's name to be taken seriously. There is a philosophy I have come to live by. It is the justice of the sower. People think revenge is about burning the house down. It isn't. Fire is easy. Destruction is cheap. True revenge is taking the ashes of the life they tried to burn, mixing it with the soil, and planting a garden so beautiful, so thriving, that it hurts them just to look at it from the other side of the gate. They are forbidden to enter, but they are forced to watch it grow. That is my justice. I didn't just take the house. I built a future they aren't invited to. If you believe that your legacy is determined by your actions, not your gender or your birth order, hit that subscribe button.